Go. Welcome, everyone. Hello, my name is David McElnay, and I'm representing the Executive Committee of the Urban Design Panel today, current chair, and very happy to introduce our exciting panel presentation entitled, as a working title, Build Oregon's Future Challenge. But first, want to do a quick blurb. There's lots of folks who've heard this before, but those of you who are new, we're excited to have you here. The Urban Design Panel is sponsored jointly by the American Institute of Architects, the American Planning Association, and the American Society of Landscape Architects, and is composed of professionals from those three organizations with a shared interest in urban design. We're joined today by Kathy Wendland, from AIA Oregon. The AIA Oregon chapter has hosted this event for many years and generously offers this monthly Zoom meeting. Our panel presentations can be found at the AIA Oregon event calendar, as well as their weekly Thursdays at 3 newsletter. So I encourage you to get on that newsletter. Kathy's going to put her contact information in the chat. So we hold these UDP Urban Design Panel presentations are held every third Tuesday of the month. To request a registration or suggest a future topic, simply send an email to Kathy at AIA Oregon. This presentation will be about 30 to 40 minutes and be followed by a Q&A session. For the Q&A, please post your questions in the Zoom chat box. And also feel free to raise your hand virtually at the end of the presentation. We can call on you for questions. I'm not sure which executive committee member is going to be managing the chat Q&A today, but we'll find out in a moment here. We'll pose the questions following the presentation. That way our friends today can focus on presenting. Also, follow-up questions can be sent directly to today's presenters via their email addresses, or if there's a singular person to send it to, I encourage our guests to place that or those emails in the chat box, if that's acceptable. As you all saw, these presentations are recorded, and you have to hit the OK to be sure that you understand that. And what's important about that is that they are archived, and that's being done by the AIA, and they can be found in the link provided in the chat. It goes back several years at this point. We do not have any continuing education units or opportunities today in any of these disciplines, but we've got a great opportunity to learn more about our subject, which is a competition, or the working concept for a competition called Build Oregon Future Challenge. And our guests today in bringing that to the table are from 1,000 Friends of Oregon, led by Gil Kelly and Jackie Lee, and Bruce Hayden are going to be our presenters today. So Gil, if you'd like to take it away from here and introduce yourself.
Sure,
Welcome.
happy to do that, David. Good, I think now afternoon, everybody. Again, I'm Gil Kelly, and some of you may know I served as planning director in Portland from 2000 to 2009, and have had similar roles in Berkeley, California, San Francisco, and Vancouver, British Columbia, and have hosted several design competitions for a number of things: housing, public spaces, and others, including helped host one that was led by my colleague Bruce Hayden, who is joining us today from Vancouver, on missing middle housing, which was quite successful. And Bruce is here to talk a bit about that after Jackie and I present our thing. As you noted, David, this working title, Building Oregon's Future Challenge, is simply that, a working title, and we're open to your suggestions of how to make it catchy. But we think that given the passage of recent legislation in Oregon over the last few years, with a real focus on housing, and particularly infill housing and affordable housing, we think that a design competition, if rightly staged, will generate a whole lot of interest throughout the state, small towns and bigger cities, about doing well-designed infill housing that is more accessible, more affordable, and helps build walkable, inclusive, sustainable neighborhoods. So that's kind of our thesis there. And we're very early in our thought process and really look forward to today's discussion with these combined disciplines to help us develop the framework for doing this. It's probably, a good part of a year from now until it's completed to get it really staged and done well and raise some money along the way and find some partners. Hopefully some of you want to be partners or your organization as well in hosting this. So that's a very brief intro. And let me just turn it over to Jackie and then to Bruce to introduce themselves.
Hey everyone, I'm Jackie Lee. I have a background mostly in community organizing. I live in Corvallis, Oregon, and I am working for 1,000 Friends as the Oregon for Everyone manager. So my job is really around supporting local policy implementation and community organizing around housing and housing policy. Yeah, so excited to talk to you today.
Bruce?
Thank you, Gil. I'm Bruce Hayden from Vancouver, BC. I got briefed on this conversation about 2 hours ago by Gil, which, as far as I'm concerned, gives me a chance to completely avoid any responsibility if the presentation goes badly, but to take credit for it, partial credit for it if it goes well. So it's a perfect situation for me. I've been working in the area of a whole bunch of different housing policy, but the particular reason I'm here is my work with the Urbanarium, which is a nonprofit I helped found more than 10 years ago now, to really to increase the quality of the civic conversation about how we build cities. And competitions have been a key part of the Urbanarium portfolio. We've now done 4 of them with a very high degree of success. And I'll talk a little bit more about that once Gil and Jackie have completed their presentation.
Thanks, Bruce. And I'll just acknowledge Bruce in the Urbanarium hosted me when I first took the Vancouver job and was selected. I was, I think, a week on the job, Bruce, and he said, well, we're just going to have a meeting of this professional group. And oh, by the way, we're going to do it downtown. We found a little theater to do it in. Well, 750 people turned out for it. So suddenly I was on stage for 2 hours explaining my life story and what the vision for Vancouver should be a week into my job. So thanks for that, Bruce. I've never forgotten that one. Anyway, so let's go to the next slide. Just wanted to say that I still remain active in a whole bunch of civic causes and more in Portland and in Oregon. And the one that I think is most precious to me is the role of 1,000 Friends Oregon, which is, as you all know, I'm sure, is now a 50-year-old organization that is the leading advocacy group in the state for good planning and keeping the spirit of Senate Bill 100 alive and well, even with new generations of legislators and new residents in Oregon who don't know much about the history there, frankly, and just assume that Oregon's the way it is because it's always been that way, instead of actually the product of very intentional effort and debate and action over the decades. So at 1,000 Friends, we're really trying to ramp up our visibility, our membership, which we've been successful at doing, and really now have a 4-part or 4-themed strategic plan that we've just adopted. So, whereas many people associated us with our first theme, which is preservation of working lands, meaning farms and forests, that the farming constitute the second largest industry sector in Oregon, keeping that alive. Our second is the sort of flip side of that coin, which is to build compact, walkable, affordable, and sociable communities inside of urban growth boundaries. And that's where today's discussion really falls. The 2 other themes that we've advanced are making sure that over the long term we have a sustainable economy with shared prosperity across all income groups. And that I think is really important because there's more and more pressure on urban growth boundaries for economic purposes, not just for housing. And then fourthly, we really want to see a combination of public education, rule changes that make decision-making at all levels in the state around land use issues much more accessible and understandable to the public, and that those decisions are really out in the open air and are not done in closed rooms before meetings and behind the scenes. So those are our four big themes and a lot of programs under each one. Jackie Lee, my colleague here, is on the staff at Thousand Friends, and she's our manager for what we call Oregon for Everyone, which is very focused on making sure we have more affordable housing. And just in a very quick numeric sense, even under somewhat lowered population projections over the next couple of decades, we need to produce about 500,000 housing units, and over half of those need to be for incomes at 80% of area median income or less. And so we know we can't do that by building suburban, large scale, large lot housing. The real need is to do infill housing, and that's why today's design competition proposal here is so relevant. And I'm just really thrilled to have Bruce online because he carried off such a great presentation along those same lines in Vancouver. So here quickly are the needs. And this 550,000.
This was my part.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah.
You take this slide, Jackie.
Cool. Yeah, so like Gil said, we have a pretty severe housing shortage in Oregon, and that shortage is particularly stark for low and moderate income individuals, families, people with disabilities, and people that experience discrimination. So the state has an estimated that we need at least 550,000 new homes in the next 20 years, and that represents a pretty substantial increase in production rates across pretty much every city in the state. And we know that the challenge isn't just to increase the rate of the current type of production we're doing. Like, we don't just need to create more single family homes. We also need to dramatically change the type and design of units, the location they're getting built, the materials they're made of, and a lot of other factors, right? So this represents a pretty huge challenge for the home building industry, and for local governments and for communities, right? Like, it's a pretty big shift, and it will require a huge amount of creativity and collaboration to make it work. Just to highlight a few things that we know about Oregon's current housing need. Of this 550,000 new homes, we know that at least 1 in 4 of them needs to be physically accessible for aging population and disabled community members. We know that right now, our current estimates show that only about 1 in 100 apartments is physically accessible. So we are far behind the need in terms of accessibility. And that's going to be a pretty big shift in home building culture. We also know that the majority of households only has 1 or 2 people. So we need to be building a lot more small homes that are affordable and appropriately sized for 1 and 2 person households. And we need to be building these small homes that are affordable to working families and low-income individuals, but that are still near existing resources and amenities. And, of course, all these units need to be planned with disaster resilience and climate resilience in front of mind. Me and Mary Kyle went to a YIMBY Town conference in New Haven a month ago, and one of the main speakers was talking about how we really cannot afford to continue investing our public and private resources into homes that are at very high risk of natural disasters, and continue relegating our most socioeconomically vulnerable residents to these very high risk areas, which is, one of the benefits of urban growth boundaries is that it already kind of serves as that buffer in terms of where we build things, but we need to continue building, fire resilient, energy efficient homes in these lower risk areas, and shifting our home building to focus on that. And so that often means within urban growth boundaries, infilling into existing neighborhoods. And of course, this is a win-win because these areas will already be connected to services and utilities, so that our public infrastructure dollars are better used.
Jackie, could I just add one little piece to what you just said, which is that 550 number? That reflects the sort of slower growth numbers, and this is a number that now has been acknowledged and prepared by the Department of Administrative Services, this sort of state agency that turns that number over to DLCD and others. So it's pretty safe bet that we need at least that number of homes over the 20 years. And I just wanted to add to what you said, Jackie, that about half, a little less than half, of those are projected to be needed and could occur within the Portland metro area. But another half is around the state, including in small and medium-sized towns and cities. So we think the design competition will need to touch both of those markets, if you will. Thanks.
Yeah. So as you guys know, this is a big challenge, and so we really need to generate a lot of creativity and investment. So our thought with doing a design competition is to really inspire that innovation, that creativity, and encourage, designers to really think about these core needs that Oregonians have in terms of their housing. And so we kind of identified this list of I guess, yeah, core needs around different types of housing. And with whatever host community that we partnered with, they might narrow this list down according to their own kind of specific needs or identify needs that are different from what is on this list. But yeah, at any given host community would theoretically identify a list of core needs, and then each design team would choose 2 or 3 of those to focus on within their design. We haven't necessarily narrowed down what the scope of or the scale of the design would be, like if we want it to just be a single house or a whole block or kind of like a neighborhood concept. But whatever it is, they would focus on kind of those core needs. We also want to ensure that each design team not only comes up with like an architectural design, but also analyzes it for financial feasibility and code feasibility. So we would ask that design teams be composed of, at the minimum, a designer, someone with experience with financial analysis, or like real estate economics, and someone with experience with like code, basically, and working with that. So yeah, each design team would come together, create a concept, and present it. And then our hope is that as we present these to the host community, it would inspire, not only the residents to feel more open and welcoming to this new type of design in their community, but it would also inspire the decision makers and policymakers to change whatever barriers need to be changed in order to make that type of building possible, and feasible. And then we want to ensure that this is not just a one and done type of situation, that we're not just like going in, hosting a design competition and getting out. So we have these kind of 4 phases as a concept. And so we anticipate that developing the challenge would probably be at least a year-long process. And then in whatever was our primary host community, we would run that challenge and then follow through with ongoing engagement to ensure that they're able to, continue to work on implementing whatever code changes might come up and trying to get some of that housing actually built. And then finally, we would learn kind of whatever lessons, what went well, what needs to be changed, and try to replicate it in another community or potentially multiple sequential communities over the coming years so that we can kind of expand the reach of it. Our first kind of like would potentially be in the Clatsop County area. We have met with Gil has kind of a existing relationship with the county planner there. I forget her title, like the housing planner.
Yeah.
And she's expressed a lot of interest in this sort of thing. And we have talked with folks in Astoria and Seaside. And so there's potentially room for us to work in Clatsop County as a primary location. And then whatever we learn from that, we could take to another community that might be interested. Gil, back to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that there are precedents we can build on, and luckily we have Bruce here to talk about one of those. And this image on the left side of the screen is actually from the Missing Middle competition that Bruce hosted and ran in Vancouver, BC. Very successful. But there are some others that are relevant here too. One that I oversaw in Portland in 2007, which was the Courtyard Family Housing, which got international interest from firms globally, and had a jury and was quite successful in doing that. There's a precedent that one of your members suggested from Los Angeles, which is called Small Lots, Big Impact, that occurred, that was pretty high profile and got a lot of interest as well. And then recently, the Department of Land Conservation Development has been developing some infill sort of design guidelines, not quite yet prototypes and designs, but that could be served up as part of the competition here. And there are clearly other competitions around. I just wanted to add a note that occurred just last evening. I was part of a lead-off presentation, a kickoff for the University of Oregon architecture students to do a student-led competition on single stair design for uh, sort of small scale apartment complexes that could make them much more efficient, usable, and affordable. And that might, serve as another precedent here, and a way that maybe even link in the possibility of undertaking that as part of this infill design competition. I do think that, and Bill Cunningham is around still, and Alyssa in Clatsop County, who can be consulted, as we have done with, whereas we're doing with Bruce on kind of shoring this up. Would love your ideas today about how to take this off. So we have some questions in a few moments here, but I just want to say that I think the state has passed a lot of authorizing legislation, including those for single stair design, which cities then have to adopt or opt into. But uh, what I took away from the Vancouver one is suddenly jurisdictions, architecture firms, developers, and neighborhood groups really could get past policy language that was abstract, and get right into the design of these things and get very excited about the shape of their communities. And Bruce will describe in a moment that we actually asked the teams there to do pro forma, so these were realistic and to identify policy obstacles, whether those were in the zoning code or the building code or just neighborhood sentiment or whatever that was. So again, we'd like to include some of that in the competition as well to make these very real. But that's the power of doing this, is to get beyond policy language and get right down to the ground on specific sites in different communities around the state, to make it real for people and get people excited about it. So that's why we're talking to you today about it. So next slide. And so, a kind of a threshold question is, and there are lots of questions, and Bruce can talk about lessons learned in terms of, prize money available, in terms of getting the interest of young and emerging firms, of what it takes to stage it in that case. And I'll let Bruce go into those details. But a couple of real key questions for us is, really the scope. We have a thousand friends, and all the legislation that I'm talking about from the state really is a statewide scope. It's not limited to one city or to Portland or even to the seven metros I think we have in the state. So how do we, stage a competition either sequentially or simultaneously that picks off, one to four communities, for example, to do that, maybe simultaneously or in sequence a few weeks apart so that we get some energy going. Again, Jackie and I, putting our heads together, think it's probably a year's worth of setup and accomplishment and then some follow-up. But part of that, as Jackie alluded to, is finding willing communities and partners, jurisdictions that are like on the edge of like, okay, what does this look like? And we're interested in doing it because, and Bruce will talk more about how that happened in Vancouver, but there was excitement by local political leaders when this happened. And so we'd like to see that start in willing places. And, we talked over the last year or so on policy issues from people in Baker City and Wallowa County, as well as cities that experienced a lot of fire damage in the Ashland to Medford corridor. As Jackie mentioned, we've found interest in Astoria and Clatsop County. clearly the Valley, the cities of Albany and Corvallis are already doing some good stuff to build on. Maybe those get augmented, and at least one place in the Portland metro as well could be of interest. We'd have to stage those so that we can logistically handle it because they're not all in one commute shed, if you will. So your thoughts and advice about that. And frankly, if you have practices that reach into those other jurisdictions, we'd love to get your thoughts about that as well. And I'll let Bruce talk about some of the incentives and awards that occurred in Vancouver because I think they could be quite parallel to what we're talking about. And Bruce will talk about design teams not being just composed of architects, but also of planners and people familiar with real estate to be able to actually do pro formas on the project to see what kind of affordability could be achieved. And then finally, again, your thoughts about partnership and partnership development, whether that includes other advocacy groups, agencies, universities, or private funders, and any thoughts along those lines? Because we think, talking with Bruce this morning, we probably need to raise about $100,000 to be able to do this well. Part of that, half of that prize money, and half to hire somebody to help logistics of the competition itself. So something along that order. And it's maybe only a half-time manager at that rate, not a full-time. So anyway, those are just some thoughts or questions we'd like your thoughts on today. But before we get into those, I'd really love to have you hear from Bruce, who's really done this as well as 3 other competitions on decoding various types of inspiring but sometimes problematic building types under current policies. Bruce.
Thank you, Gil. Yeah, Gil is always one of the challenges of this is always sounds like it's only a single individual, of course. When in my work with the Urbanarium, we and I know some people have joined the call later. Our goal really was to enhance the quality and character of the conversation around building cities in this region. And we found competitions were actually have been a very successful aspect of that. We've now done, as Gil mentioned, 4 of them. It's absolutely not just me. A competition is a lot of work, and there's a ton of people that were involved. I was the jury chair and the lead organizer for the first one, but there are many, many participants, which was the Missing Middle competition in 2017. So I thought I'd just touch very briefly on a few issues that I think are important. One was, and both Jackie and Gil touched on these. One is the importance. I'll be honest, I was actually very concerned that we would not get a lot of responses if we asked too much detail from the teams. And so, for example, to ask for a pro forma as part of a competition was, in my experience, very, very unusual. And but our goal was twofold. One was that we didn't want this to be a kind of ideas competition. I call it the buildings on sticks competition, in the sense that here's all these crazy ideas to solve the housing crisis, with underwater buildings and things like that. And those can be really amazing competitions. But our goal was different. We really wanted people to grapple with the hardcore technical, logistic, zoning, and cost details of actually building stuff. And something interesting happened that I thought was actually a bit unusual. I think what happened, we got good response and continued to have more and more responses to our competitions, even though we've asked for quite a lot of technical detail. I think some of what's happened is that the designers and architects that don't necessarily consider themselves kind of leading edge, award-winning fancy designers are actually really interested in these challenges. So we get a really wide range of people who want to build things. And that's been very successful. Mostly our entrants have been younger firms, which again, we were very pleased. And I think one of the reasons that our ongoing success was we're starting with the Missing Middle. We really we took the opportunity to celebrate the winners. The winner of our first Missing Middle competition is on the Urbanarium board with me now and helped organize our latest tall timber tower competition. So there's been a real kind of goal as well to not just have it about solving the problem, but also have it elevate the careers of the people that participate. And I think that's been beneficial. Some of that is prize money. We have a range of prizes, but I should have looked this up before. I can't remember what the Missing Middle was, but remembering the most recent one, for example, was first prize was about $20,000. And even in our denuded Canadian dollars, that's not bad if you're a small firm. And it actually means that people can spend some time on it. Of course, there will only be a very small number of winners, but that's an important value. Um, One of the things that we did in terms of the sites is we were very interested in making sure that it also wasn't just what I think of as an urban hipster challenge. Like, they're kind of trendy downtown Vancouver sites. We wanted people to grapple with the kind of exigencies of more suburban and more remote locations. Our first one's always in the Metro Vancouver region, not in smaller communities. Um, but we actually, when you signed up for the competition, you're actually randomly assigned a site. And the goal again was to get a range of sites and a range of issues from the kind of more densely older urbanism to the much newer urbanism. And that I think was actually a very successful thing. And it got people who often wouldn't think about those kinds of challenges considering them. Uh, we've actually found that our funding, we've been kind of strategic with our competitions about what they're part of the issues we're dealing with are part of the public conversation. Certainly in 2017, when we did the missing middle conversation, the whole issue of urban densification, especially in existing single family neighborhoods, was a hot topic. Our provincial government, the equivalent of your state government, was about to start enforcing the requirement for density to actually essentially eliminate single family house lots. So it was a topic that was of interest to the planning and architectural community around the region. So the timing was important. And that's a significant thing. Um, One of the things that we did in terms of, and Jackie's little chart was very useful. It's easy to think that the work ends when the competition is done. And in our view, it almost only started. We did several things after the competition was done. One of the things that we did was that I kind of did a little traveling roadshow around the region to present to planning departments and sometimes to city councils, including the city of Vancouver with Gil's invitation. And I bought the three winning team representatives along with me. In this case, they happened to all be Vancouver based. Our subsequent competitions actually got much more global interest. The Tall Timber Tower, we actually only had one local team as a winner. So we had people zoom in, which is much more possible now. But those kind of conversations where people could actually meet and talk with policymakers, I thought were actually extremely valuable. We also published quite a lovely publication, which, it's always hard to see these here. And what we did as well is we actually took all of that. We asked as part of the competition for people to make recommendations about policy changes. And then we kind of collated the critical policy changes that came out and really tried to summarize them. And I can just briefly go through those. And then, but one was the idea of, and again, the policy context in Oregon is not familiar to me. So, but part of the goal was to rezone broadly. There's often a pressure in our region to kind of, oh, let's just do a little test study of this area. And the problem is that there's a kind of massive density bump that's localized, which in our experience really changes the land values. So our goal was to say, make big picture policy changes that over a large area. Um, Almost all the teams suggested reducing parking requirements very dramatically. Um, that was a big deal. And then one of the constraints that we consistently come up in this region was setbacks and allowable heights, which end up being kind of putting very tight envelopes. So we suggested some revisions to those. And two more slightly interesting ones. One was to really allow the possibility of a greater ecosystem, which we actually followed up with in a later competition to allow commercial activities in residential neighborhoods, like, small hairdressers, lawyers' offices, those sorts of things, even potentially retail. That was something we suggested. And last, and I don't know if this is an issue in Oregon, but there's actually, in my experience, a fair number of what I think of as sort of middle class biases around forms of housing that I think are quite interesting. Until in the city of Vancouver, for example, I think it's still illegal on the books that you can't have sort of 5 or 6 people sharing a house unless they're related. And I've actually been working with a collaborator of mine, Happy Cities, on looking at the city of Vancouver livability housing livability policies. And one of the things that consistently comes up is I think of this kind of middle class. For example, one of the planners was completely outraged that we would permit two-bedroom apartments with only one bathroom. And part of this is one of my personal kind of bugbears is, yes, family housing is really, really critical. I tend to worry more about the recent single immigrant who comes into Canada or in the United States, in your case, with no language, no English language skills, and is completely socially isolated. And no forms of housing for those people are often very, very difficult to build. And the last thing I'll say, and then I'll open up to questions. I noted the issue of disaster resilience, and it's actually an area that is really interesting to me because I've been doing this work on evidence-based tools to support social connection in design. So I've got built a kind of an agent-based modeling, artificial intelligence-powered tool to understand social connection in building prior to construction. And one of my goals with that work is really to help solve the recognition that when we speak about resilience, we often think of making buildings harder. And in fact, if you look at it, the critical issue in support and disaster resilience is actually very straightforward, is whether your neighbors know you're there. We tend to think about. And so I think that's just a broader issue around all forms of housing that is also related to, I think, solving what I consider to be a desperate social isolation crisis. So that's nothing to do with the competition, just happens to be stuff I'm passionate about. So very happy to open questions.
Thanks, Bruce. I just wanted to add one little piece to what you were saying, which is my memory of the missing middle competition in Vancouver was, and whether this was a requirement or not, or whether it was just the teams picking up on the theme of this is about neighborhood building, not just about structure building, is that most of the submittals looked in detail at a site and a structure to do what you said, which is to say, is this real in terms of a pro forma, and what are the specific obstacles that would allow this to happen? But also they would draw a larger, full block or even a full neighborhood diagram that would show how does the neighborhood look? And there you could get a variety of structures, even of uses like you talked about, Bruce, and even some common green spaces. So it really kind of lit up the neighborhood interest. This wasn't just, oh, we're going to slot a building in somewhere next to you, but it's like, this is what the future neighborhood could look like. And that was very, very powerful. And I think something that we'd want to incorporate into this competition as well. So anyway, as you said, Bruce, I think, we're happy, David, to open this up for questions and comments on the questions that I listed or anything else here. So thanks.
Yeah, I guess I'll just jump in here. Thanks so much, Gail, Jackie, and Bruce for the presentation. David, I was gonna ask your question, but I'm gonna let you ask it because there's a lot of words in there. I think you could demonstrate easier than I can. Yeah.
I did kind of, I had to stop typing because I sort of started with asking if we were going to look at Oregon statewide. With something that's always fascinated me about Oregon is like, which Oregon are we talking about, right? Because I'm not from Oregon, and it's high desert, and it's full on temperate rainforest, and it's ocean edge, and so there's all these different Oregons and different scales of town. So I did hear, and Bruce, and especially what you were just talking about kind of teasing out some of those themes. But in my question, I had asked, well, is it something that's going to be differentiated by scale of community, population, or density of population, or existence of transit or not? Because there's both stark differences across Oregon. Cost of construction is another one that popped into my head, or local economic drivers, or climate zone, and that kind of. So, it's that's, and Gil, this is also, I'm talking to you, that is there some way to achieve your goal of sort of looking at all of Oregon? That's writ rather large when I think about it in those terms. How can you focus a design competition, or does it become a great quilt of things?
Yeah, well, Bruce and Jackie should weigh in, but my thought about this is that we want to kind of make this less abstract and therefore tailor make it to those local situations where we selected communities that we've built a relationship ahead of time during the formation of the competition before we get to the actual competition, so we understand those local conditions, and so that the instructions to the competitors there are tailored to that situation. And
Yeah.
that's why this question about, do we do several simultaneously? Do we do them in sequence over a year or two? How do we do that? And how then logistically, how does that work for the competition organization and all that kind of stuff? But I think to get at your point, it's really critical one, because we want this to resonate for different locations and different types of communities, whether those are economic or climate conditions around the state. So that's a big thesis here. And Jackie and I have done a little bit of pre-work in Clatsop County, and we'd like to do that in a Valley city, and a Southern Oregon city, and Eastern Oregon, and maybe Central Oregon city over time. So to do all those at once would be a challenge, but to do them in a sequence would work. Personally, I'd like to do more than one at a time. Like if we could stage 3 at a time, it would be great, but maybe that's too much. On the other hand, we want to be able to attract the interest of firms, and with some prize money to be able to, do it right. So that's kind of the reason for putting these questions up. The first one is, how do we pull this off, kind of thing. But thank you for that question, David.
Sure thing. And maybe it's a representative, mix that certainly this
Right.
interested professionals can advise, and so can economic directors of small towns and big towns,
Correct.
know their specific ailments. But I don't know,
Yeah.
if anybody else had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think Gil said it really well. And I want to add that kind of my program, Oregon for Everyone, one of the core goals is to highlight like those communities that don't get as much attention around their housing policy, like Eastern Oregon, Southern Oregon, kind of coastal communities don't get the same level of like attention and investment, and people kind of yeah, just don't know as much about what the conditions are, what the possibilities are, or the challenges and things. So we want to make sure to bring really targeted attention to those areas. And I've gone to like on a number of road trips to different places around the state to start meeting people in person, just to start building those relationships and make sure it's not just like a, you know, outside organizer type. I mean, yeah, just trying to like build real relationships with folks from different parts of the state and show genuine interest. And I think that's what we need to do here, like really target it to their needs and their specific goals.
I'm going to add a little bit because I'm going to take a very slightly different perspective. I think sometimes the mistake when you get a bunch of designers together, and I include myself in this, is to think that the goal is to get a series of designs that will get built, right? And I think my experience, my belief is the goal is to get the attention of policymakers and the broader public. And so I think one of the ways that you do that is you keep the challenge. I'm totally agree you should, and in fact must do it in different locations, but to keep the core challenge the same. What is the problem you're trying to solve, and how can this problem get solved in different locations? My first opinion is that would be more successful. And I would, if you possibly could, do it all at once. And some of the reason for that, again, is simply that what you want to do is break through. Like we're all in a kind of period of like endless media news, right? And so I do think there's a kind of a very, very specific opportunity for a window to kind of engage with policymakers, and to do it all at once, I think also allows comparison of different opportunities. Like, how is this challenge solved in this location? How is this challenge solved in this location? Whereas when you sequence it, I think it creates a danger that you just bleed the energy a little bit. And I do believe in competitions that there's a kind of an energy around it that's important to kind of harness and get right if you can. So that's just my thinking about it. It's not really in conflict with Jackie and Gil are saying. And I don't think, in my experience, there isn't a huge kind of time win in running one competition or versus two smaller competitions. There's all the kind of issues of registration and gathering juries and all that stuff that's kind of saying. So again, keeping the problem the same, seeing how that problem gets implemented in different locations would be my first intuition. I could be totally wrong about that.
Mm-hmm. Bruce, one question for you. Remind me, in terms of the specific sites that were looked at in the missing middle competition, they were not just generic sites, they were actual lots and blocks and
Yes.
block patterns. Did you require, if you isolated one site for the primary new structure design, um, permission on the part of the landowner, or was it just this was a generic enough site that you could just do it?
Yeah, we didn't require permissions of the landowner because in the end of the day, we weren't proposing actually to build anything. These are really just ideas.
Hmm.
And in fact, in many cases, part of the goal was to challenge what you could normally build on those sites anyway. So
Hmm.
it wasn't seen. We didn't get permissions from the landowner, and we didn't have any problems with that. Maybe
Yeah.
again, slightly different in American context, but certainly that wasn't an issue for us.
Well, there's a related question in the chat from Karine that just, gets at that next level of question, which is, are these buildable? Are these implementable? And I think that's clearly a goal of ours here, and one of the reasons for doing it in different contexts, even if there's a common challenge and theme, like you said, Bruce. And part of that, Karine, is motivating changes in local policy where that needs to happen to remove some obstacles so these are actually implementable. And part of it is just the design inspiration and frankly the young firms working on these to be able to find the willing landowner and just start building something. And I think, Bruce, some of that has already happened in Vancouver
Yeah.
since. So I think, Karine, that's a perfect question, and that's clearly right in our line of sight.
Yeah,
Well,
thanks for picking up. Oh, go ahead, Bruce.
yeah, I just want to briefly respond to Kareen's question because I think it's a very important one. I think it's a strategic question again about, and I have no skin in the game here. To what extent do you want to see what can be done with existing policy, and to what extent do you want to make proposals to revise existing policy? The way we did it, which doesn't have to be the way you do it, is we consciously said what what can be done without again, tripling density or things like that. What we kind of tried to set, if you were to expand the envelope of possibility, how would you expand it in a way that was seen as realistic and achievable? But we
Yeah.
didn't say you had to meet existing zoning and building code guidelines exactly. We did say you had to identify the ones that you weren't meeting, which was an interesting balance. And that gave us a real important tool for it.
Yeah.
Yeah, you guys picked up on that thread of that question. Thanks for doing that. Fiona, you have a couple points here. I'm probably better in your voice if you wanted to summarize your.
Sure. Yeah, I dropped a link in the chat. It's a couple of years old, this podcast, but they're a mission-driven developer up in Seattle named Frolic, and I was really intrigued by the interview. It talked about kind of what was discussed here: isolation, social isolation, and kind of the value of cooperative housing. And I don't think I ever realized before that it's not just a social structure kind of format that cooperatives are, but like there's a whole financial tool that you can use. I'm not going to paraphrase it because I'm still trying to figure out how to digest it, but it's interesting. I think one of the key points that I would suggest for just kind of thinking about this, it feels like all the zoning and code changes in the world plus good design might not actually still make for like viable development. And so I wouldn't understate like the role, again, not necessarily like requiring performers, but just it feels like the really big challenge right now, as I understand it, is just the lack of kind of the funding and how to make housing like viable from a
Yeah.
financial perspective. And I don't know what the solution is, but I think that's the really important nut to try to crack. And I think
Yeah,
as it intersects with these two things, it's really important. But
I agree with you, Fiona. And Bruce, I recall that in the Vancouver competition, at least one uh, really nice proposal actually put forward a co-op housing
Yes.
as their kind of foundation. So that could be part of the invitation is like, how could this be fun? Like, show us your pro forma, sure, but
there's
how's
like
this
a
gonna
different
come together?
financial
Yeah,
model.
financial
Yeah,
model.
different
Yeah,
tools. Yeah.
yeah.
Like what can those bring to the
That's a
equation?
great point. Yeah. And construction costs vary across the state too. So,
I mean, I'm personally really interested. I feel like I keep reading studies about kind of, I think it was DLCD that put one out. Kind of 3-story you know, sort of simple housing and below is like the most economically viable right now. And so it makes me think that kind of the real opportunity here is not really within the Portland region. Like, could we focus on the kind of first tier? It does feel like it's kind of small to mid-scale cities that like, I don't want to say it's easier, but it feels like it's more viable economically.
Right.
So anyways, just like, I think that's hearing that half of the need is in outside of the Portland region is actually like kind of promising that we can, that feels more achievable in some way.
And there might be a metro, more suburban jurisdiction in the metro area too. That
True.
could be a
Yep.
candidate. But yeah,
Yeah.
I think you're hitting something right. If we wanted to do a more substantial jump in scale, we'd probably concentrate it on, you know, the inner parts of the Portland region. But I think you're absolutely right. I think the idea here is to enlist this kind of energy and innovation and building across the state in smaller and medium-sized cities.
Cool. And then one other thought, and then I'll pass it back to you, Jeremy. It's just everyone's probably read the city of Portland just released a RFP for a social housing study. That'll be really interesting. I mean, I think it'll take about a year until they deliver a product to council, but just I think that will have a lot of good lessons learned too.
Yeah.
Again, kind of working in tandem with this effort.
Yeah.
I want to just jump in and Robert Croster had a question about would it benefit to solicit feedback from developers on what policies are most challenging. And one of the things that we actually found that was interesting was a lot of the teams for the Missing Middle competition included developers as part of their, especially smaller developers as part of their team member, which we think is something that you really should actually encourage. And again, it was mostly the thoughtful kind of smaller scale developers, of which there aren't a ton in this region. But that was extremely beneficial, I think, from a organizational and kind of credibility perspective as well.
Yeah, Bruce, it's David. I don't know if you just mentioned big ideas, small lots, but the LA competition just recently last year was focused on that, right? On having a developer on the team for that very reason, to both look at pro forma, but also sort of look for what are the catches. I was going to type this, but I'm just going to jump in really quickly and say that that Oregon has indeed been going through a lot of policy changes, especially if you're kind of on the receiving end, like my planning division has been, in terms of having to implement them into your each city's code. And CFEC, for example, eliminating parking across Oregon for any city bigger than 10,000 people. And that's titanic, really, in terms of a step forward, and the sort of tackling it and in pulling it into local codes, and sort of I'm excited about it because it just mandates beginning to explore, right? But I will say that there's a lot of that going on over the last year, and it's got a lot of different directions. It's sort of poking holes at process, and it kind of trying to unclog housing from in maybe not the most refined approach. I don't think that everyone in the state has policy change fatigue, but there is a lot of moving parts happening right now that's focused on that desire to create more housing. I see the good and the bad of it in my daily work, and I don't think there's no reason to add more insight. I just thought that would be something to bring into the thought process of like, what does this competition look like, knowing that the state of Oregon is just firing salvos of change out policy wise, and we're trying to implement it across the state. The smaller towns are having much more sort of difficulty doing that than larger cities policy wise, but then larger cities, you see immediate change in terms of the kinds of projects that have started. I think the economy is a tamper on that, but in any case, I just wanted to kind of point that out, and thought, is there some way to kind of refine or just not necessarily add to the confusion when it comes to the goal of the competition?
I Yeah, so my kind of thought on that is that a lot of the changes that the state has mandated, a lot of the big ones have already been implemented in a lot of communities. And then people are kind of looking at that and wondering like, okay, so we've done these big changes, but there's still these ongoing barriers and there's still things that are preventing it. And oftentimes those barriers are really hyper local. And like we're past the point of being able to do kind of broad, like every community needs to do this thing. And now we're at the point of like, okay, every community needs to meticulously analyze their own code and figure out what their like hyper local barriers are and how to eliminate those. And so I
Mhm.
think this can draw attention to that. Um, and I also think that um, a lot of us who are in this work, know really well what the changes have been, but most people have absolutely no idea, or if they know that changes have been made, they don't really understand them or understand what's possible now, or kind of like what those would look like in their communities and neighborhoods. And so we want to, yeah, draw attention to celebrate the changes that have been made and the opportunities that it opens up, as well as drawing attention to um, additional changes that might help things go a little bit further. Um, and yeah, it is kind of as Bruce said, like it's really about um, bringing attention of the policymakers in the community and kind of generating that energy and excitement, um, as much as it is about actually building anything.
If I want to just add a couple things to what Jackie said, which I thought was great. What I think, David, is the question is, what are the pain points right now? The pain points now are different than, say, when we did our competition in 2017, right? The pain points there was that the policy didn't exist to support this at all. If I'm hearing Jackie correctly, part of what's going on is that, it's more granular. What does this actually look like when it hits the ground, and what's going to be the effect on communities in a day-to-day level? And then the question is there are there aspects of that that can really work to, I always kind of focus on publicity, not that publicity is the thing, but in the end of the day, what we want to have is broader community conversations about these issues. And so, the timing and the pain points become really important, and getting super clear on exactly what you're trying to achieve, and then being rigorous about not trying to achieve more than that. And again, just to keep it focused, I think is a very important thing. So what's the exact problem statement, and how are you going to meet that problem statement? What are the kind of people and teams that need to be participants to make that work?
And just I could add on to that, Bruce. I do think we haven't fully fleshed out what the problem statement is, and I think that's part of the next work ahead of us. And this conversation will really help us with that, because I think it should be a combination of sort of replicable and also highly local. And so, in terms of the results that are produced, uh, I would say that, again, as I said in the very beginning, there's a lot of new policy that the state has done, and Jackie's right to say that most people don't even know what that is. But I think the other thing is we're still likely to see very uninspired designs that feel like an imposition to some communities. And I think part of what the design competition can challenge, particularly if they're asked to look not just at a single site, but at a neighborhood context, is to say, how could this design be something we really want in our neighborhoods for people who are single, people who are elderly, people who are young families, who are like that sort of missing cohort in so many communities that are really challenged around affordability and housing supply. Suddenly, the NIMBY faction gets really uh, cooled down and even excited in some cases about, oh yeah, if I could downsize in my own neighborhood, I'm on board. And that's a lot of what we were managed to accomplish in Vancouver, was to sort of turn a lot of those NIMBYs into YIMBYs, because they could stay in their own neighborhood in a smaller unit, and
Yeah,
a family could come behind and occupy their big house they didn't need anymore, and that kind of
yeah,
thing. So
that's
I think
great.
part of that is that. And the other thing is, back to Fiona's point, I saw that for a short time at least, um, Jessica's Deb, who's one of the key planners at Metro, was on the line here. And she's managing the Future Vision project for Metro, and maybe something comes out of that process a year or so down the line here where there's a competition that's focused on, higher and denser types in the Portland metro region, so that this competition doesn't have to accomplish all of that. So I just want to
Right.
throw that out there.
Yeah. Well, along those lines, Gil, I'll add a little energy to that insight, give you some handles to grab a hold of in this conversation, which is that many communities, large and small, across the whole state, really are having trouble like putting resources into developing these new policy changes that I mentioned, or
Hmm.
even exploring others. Some are lucky to get cottage cluster as a chapter in their code, let alone
Yeah,
study cottage clusters across the communities, across the community of the neighborhoods. So I think that this could solve a very, very pragmatic, real need where the community would embrace using the competition as a way to explore what's either in the code or
yeah,
what's aspirational about creating housing, or what's coming down from the state, DCED, telling folks what to do and not do. So there's a very real value that only the biggest communities can put resources into studying
yeah,
these things. And even then it's a challenge. Like, notice that RFP for the city of Portland is specifically about social housing.
right.
So that doesn't cover, there's a lot of great infill going on in Portland. So in a lot of ways, maybe the challenges there are different than some of the smaller communities and what they're
Yeah,
trying to do and
I
just
think
test
that's
fit
right.
things and try
Yeah.
things.
And just on the social housing question, I mean, there are kind of two flavors of that. One is the Vienna model, which is completely publicly supported through tax dollars development, and they've been at it for 100 years now,
Yeah.
doing permanent social housing through public funding. The Vancouver model that I was part of was to do fairly aggressive social housing, but as developer contributions in trade for higher heights and things like that, sometimes within the same project, sometimes through a cash out kind of in lieu sort of situation. But again, built a lot of social housing in Vancouver that is permanently affordable. And so there are two different models to explore that. I think the Vancouver housing folks and the council who are interested in this are really pursuing the Vienna model, which is great, but a very steep climb. And it takes decades to get up to numbers that are really going to be sustainable. So this competition is not trying to take on that question as much as how can we make more traditional financing mechanisms available to provide some level of affordability. But as Fiona was promoting, maybe somebody's got a great model, whether that's co-op housing or some other version that approaches that social housing result as part
Yeah.
of it.
I think you're right. I think there's a lack of familiarity. We're coming up on the 1 o'clock hour
Oh
where
yeah,
lots of
sorry.
us professionals have to run for our responsibilities. But I think we are bringing some of the city folks, the city of Portland, who went on that recent trip.
Mhm.
We're trying to bring them and some of the design professionals to this urban design panel to get observations from those real examples, European models that have
Yeah,
been around, and love to explore it. So, Gil, it's a big subject, and we were looking for input. Hopefully we gave a little bit of help and food for thought.
yeah,
I think a working title needs to be worked on. We can all throw those, fill your inbox
yeah.
with ideas for working title of your competition. But gonna have to ask you to give your final thoughts here, your team, and we'll have to wrap the panel up for today.
Well, I guess I would just end with that second question on my list, which is what are your thoughts, and you can send them subsequently, about fundraising, because we're probably in that 100,000 plus thing to really carry this off, and partnerships, formal or informal, that could help get this off the ground and help with disseminating the results and all kinds of stuff. And whether your panel is a potential sponsor or not, those kinds of questions for us and just shaping this thing would be really helpful. As well as, of course, should there be a financial prize for the winners and that kind of thing. Those are all good questions that you and Bruce and others could really help us with. So,
Well, I
but
really
thank you.
encourage our members here at the Urban Design Panel, and especially folks that are here today, to send anybody and everybody, either us on the executive committee or through to Gil and Bruce and Jackie, to keep that conversation going. I know I can, on behalf of the committee, offer this urban design panel as a platform. If you need to take a few passes at focusing and sharpening the vision here, we can also try to ask our membership to sort of come prepared,
Okay.
this time we really want to weigh in with opinions and things like that. We've done working sessions where Aaron Riom, who's on this call, has put together a Miro board, and we've done all kinds of thought, pinning thoughts on the wall. So we can try our best from that perspective. And Fiona's throwing in there cross-state team collaboration is something that should be considered. I would also point out that some of these communities I'm thinking about, that although they may not have staff to put towards making these studies, may have small budgets to put towards something that when they're all pinned together, create enough to sort of stimulate this competition concept that you have. So I think there's some light there at the tunnel too. So.
Yeah, and just along those lines, David, what Jackie was saying is, I think, we'd love to find a few willing collaborators in this, in terms of cities that really are interested in doing this. And so whether they have money or not is another thing, but at least going to where the fertile ground is first, and using that, I think, is probably a key piece. And finally, I just see Aaron's question about timeline. And, Thousand Friends doesn't need to be the sole owner of this effort. We're just trying to mount it, and we'd love to have partners in it, both financial and otherwise expert partners and civic partners. So just wanted to say that. And we think that kind of once we're really in the shoot, it's probably a year-long deal to pull off. It could be a little less time, but I think we're not even in the shoot yet. So this is a very early conversation. So think about kind of this ending 18 months from now, something like that. I mean, we'd love to do it sooner, but it's going to take some time to build it and to raise money and all that. So.
Understood. Fiona's comment was about cross-state team collaboration could be super interesting. Basically, maybe you could build a bulletin board where you pair interested parties, and you have sort of a rural architect and an urban economist, or unlikely pairs that would be looking at the same thing. I know in previous work, I became very aware of workforce housing needs on coastal towns that don't have it, right? And you're seeing that all the way from here to Bozeman, Montana, as an issue. So that's kind of a fun thought there. But in any case, we are going to have to wrap the urban design panel for today, Gil, and circle back, please, to me, and we'll get you back in with the executive committee to talk about another iteration. Bruce, it was very nice to meet you. Jackie, very nice to meet you as well. Thanks so much for your time.
Invite me back for the social housing conversation. I'd love to be part of that one.
December.
Yep. We'll look forward to it. See you all next month for the urban design panel.
Sounds cool. Thank you.
Thanks all.